Stapleton. In this region, we know him from the Tesla files. Jason is actually a personal hero of mine. Jason, welcome to N1. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. We have so much to talk about, and I would love it if these were different times where we could just enjoy the luxury to talk only about the science. But let's go back to Afghanistan, Jason. Bring us back to the time when you went there, under what circumstances, and what was your exact job there?
So I first went to Afghanistan in 2006 as part of a paramilitary organization called Blackwater that did high threat security work and close protection work for the U.S. government, more specifically for the U.S. State Department. And my job was to protect the U.S. ambassador there from harm as he traveled throughout the city of Kabul and if he decided to go outside of there, which I don't believe he ever did. And we also handled all the close protection work for the people of high importance to the U.S. government. So senators, congressmen, high-ranking officials, anybody who came through Afghanistan during the time that I was there, we handled their security, either that or if it was the president or vice president, we would work with the Secret Service, who has a special team that does that type of security work. So that was my job. I got to see a lot of the way the State Department works and the way that the U.S. Department of Defense works, the Army and the military, as well as some of the three-letter agencies that you might be familiar with.
That was a critical time for Afghanistan. This is exactly when you were there. Tell us a little bit more, how did your position there as a military contractor really work? What did you see on the ground? What things were apparent to you then, and what things are different or apparent to you now?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that I got to do is I got to see a little bit of all sides. And so let's say, I'll give you for example, let's say that we had a dignitary or a senator or someone come in and they're really concerned about the Afghan police and whether or not the Afghan police are being well funded and well trained. And he would say, I want to go out to this police headquarters where they're training these guys, and I want to meet with the locals and the people on the ground, and I want to see what's happening there. So we would drive them out there. And most of the work that was done as far as the training and the operations side goes for the State Department was handled by U.S. contractors like myself. Now, I was on the high threat protection side, but there was another group of people who did all of the training for the Afghan National Army. And there was another group of people who did training for the Afghan police. And so during that time, I got to kind of go around and see a little bit about how all of that works, and sit in on some of the meetings, and just kind of keep my mouth shut and listen to the back and forth that happened there, as well as do things like take the U.S. ambassador to the palace. That was a regular run that we would do frequently. At the time, it was President Karzai who was in power, and I would get to kind of see how that works as well. And so when we kind of talked before, I've been somewhat critical of the response to the U.S.'s response to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I think that there are some people who actually believe that this could have happened another way. And that we could have found a way to leave Afghanistan and not have it turn into just the hot mess that it is now, and that we could see a world where it didn't go back to the Taliban and it didn't go right back to what it was 20 years ago. But the truth is, that was always the way it was going to be. We knew that I knew that in 2006 after talking with the folks who were running the training for the Afghan police, and after talking with some of the contractors who handled DoD military stuff in Iraq for the Iraqi military. We knew the writing was on the wall. And when you combine that with a total and complete lack of a cohesive military strategy, a strategic strategy to win, it was clear very early on that this was not going to end well, and that we were just pouring money into a black hole that ultimately was going to end up going back to what it was before we got there.
We have so much to talk about. I listen to your podcasts a lot. And there was this one thing that really stayed with me, and this is the question that I would like to try to answer with you. How do you enslave a nation? And is Afghanistan an enslaved nation? Have you ever had the feeling that the US was the occupier rather than the Afghan ally? And why try, and this is what you talk about on your podcast as well, why try westernize a Middle Eastern country, knowing that the scenario
well, you got three questions in there. So let me attack the first question. So you asked, how do you enslave a nation? Primarily, you see nations enslaved in one of two ways. Either you submit them through physical force and through, I guess, totalitarianism, or you can enslave them by simply taking their wealth away from them, their ability to make money, and then providing them services. So high tax countries are a form, if you ask me, are a form of enslavement, because what you're really doing is taking money out of somebody's pocket that they could spend freely for themselves and then giving them services back in return that they may or may not want. And if you do that on a broad enough scale and you weaken someone's financial position enough, then you can, in a sense, enslave them, even though it was kind of a bloodless coup, so to speak. In Afghanistan, it was very much an enslavement of totalitarianism. And we can get into the history a little bit if you want to, but this was not a new thing. And I think your second question was, have I ever viewed Americans as occupiers inside of Afghanistan?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm not quite sure how you could view America as anything other than that. One of the great misconceptions about the Taliban and the Mujahideen, more specifically, is that these are somehow terrorists.
But Jason, why I ask this? I ask this because usually in the media, more often, we hear from the US government that what was going on in Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere else in the world where the United States had their war is actually giving sort of a democracy to a country or westernizing it, or there was always this reason, or I won't say excuse, but it was an excuse to actually go there and stay there for, now in this case, 2 decades. And in the end, we have a scenario that we had 20 years ago. So we don't really see anything happening differently than what we've seen in Afghanistan happening 20 years ago. This is why I'm asking this question.
So you're asking, has it changed? Is that more?
Yes. What do we say to the public is the truth? What did United States do in Afghanistan?
Oh, why we were there? It was pretty clear why we were there. We were there initially because we wanted to get Osama bin Laden, who we believed to be responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attack. But very quickly, we had the chance to get him in late 2001, and that's not some sort of like conspiracy theory. It's actually, it's a fact at this point that we had a chance to get him, and we let him kind of slip through our fingers because we couldn't mobilize fast enough. And so then it became an occupation to fight the Taliban, which were really the Taliban were created by the U.S. in the 1980s when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. And we ended up supporting the Mujahideen in that fight. And one of the groups inside of there was the Taliban. And after we left, and this was a big problem, and I don't think people really understand that this whole mess was really created by U.S. foreign policy, which is the reason why we see so much terrorism and hatred towards the U.S. today, is because when we came in and supported the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union, once they defeated the Soviet Union, we just left. We just went back home. We said, okay, now we're going to leave you in this country and to your own devices. And that set off a massive civil war. And the most totalitarian, the most brutal group in Afghanistan at that time was the Taliban. And they were the ones who emerged victorious. And that's what they've had in Afghanistan since the 1980s is Taliban rule. And so, that's the big problem, is that it all started back there. And if we want to really understand who we were fighting against when we went in after 9/11. We weren't just fighting Al-Qaeda. That was one small group. We also decided we were going to attack the Taliban as well. And the Taliban are not terrorists. They're brutal. They're terrible human beings, but they're not a terrorist organization. They're a military, a guerrilla military fighting an insurgency. And we are the insurgency. America was the insurgency. Wow. And so if you understand it from that perspective, you kind of get what was happening over there.
That is a completely different approach than all of the interviews that we have conducted in the past couple of years when it came to Afghanistan. This is a new approach. Okay, I like it. I like discussing this. The third question was, why try westernize a Middle Eastern country such as Afghanistan?
Yeah, I've never understood that about U.S. foreign policy. I think it does far more harm than it does good. You can go back all the way. There was a time when we didn't concern ourselves in a war with winning hearts and minds. The goal was to ensure that some aggressing force was put down. So you can go back to World War II. Really, the policy changed for the U.S., I believe, during the Vietnam War, where the idea was we're now fighting an insurgent, we're now fighting a guerrilla war, a war of occupation. And that's not a winnable war for your audience to understand. I challenge anybody to find in recent history, going all the way back to the Roman era, of any country that was able to sustain or win a war of occupation. It doesn't work. And so we started this process of, if we want to win this war, we have to win the hearts and minds of the people. And that's led us to where we are today. U.S. foreign policy is always about spreading freedom and democracy. The problem is it doesn't work. It's failed every time we've tried it in every country. Egypt, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen. Now we're fighting a proxy war with the Saudis in Yemen, which can be considered nothing other than genocide. There's just awful foreign policy that has led to a lot of the problems and the uprise of militant Islam over the last 2 to 3 decades.
So with other words, you say that the U.S. directly helped Islamist extremist organization rise all over Middle East. Is this what you're saying?
Yeah, and not just in Afghanistan, but in Iraq too. So after we were able to, with the surge, America always talks about the surge in Iraq and how the surge ended up pushing down the militant resistance there. But what really happened was they just moved out of Iraq and they moved into Syria. And we started funding a small organization that would later be called ISIS. And we decided we were going to fight that and support those fighters because they stood against the president in Syria at the time. And we wanted to try and oust that dictator because we thought Assad was a terrible person, right? So we ended up funding what would become ISIS. And then we have to fight ISIS now, and we have a war in ISIS. And we do all of this and spend all of this money in training their local troops to fight a war that they don't want to fight, that they're not interested in fighting. And that's why you see when we started to pull out that they kind of just threw up their arms because they have no real interest in the ideas that we support and believe in, like freedom, democracy, those kinds of things, at least not to the extent that they would give their own lives or fight and die for those things.
Now we're talking about money, and not just money, we're talking about people, soldiers, American sons and daughters losing their lives for causes that are obviously untrue.
None of us want to go and fight in a war that we believe is unwinnable, and nobody likes to see, thousands of U.S. troops and contractors dead, only to have the country handed right back over to the Taliban. But a lot of us saw the same thing that I'm telling you now very early on and said, what are we doing here? If there's no strategy for victory and we're just out here going on patrols and trying to kill these other people who are trying to kill us, and there's no real strategy beyond that, why are we risking American blood and coin for that? That's foolish. Not only that, but look at the numbers of Afghans dead. 66,000 Afghans dead, 66,000 police, I think, and 47,000 Afghan civilians. It's just war is a terrible, terrible business. and you should only fight it if you absolutely have to. And while I did support the notion of going in and finding the Al Qaedas and the Osama bin Ladens in Afghanistan, it became really apparent that supporting a war of occupation in Afghanistan was not going to have the desired outcome. But it didn't matter to the U.S. government. They were happy to just spend trillions of dollars and justify their existence over there for as long as humanly possible. And you can even see the American military or the American media today just chastising them for withdrawing from this 20-year debacle that we've been in. It's really shameful. The media has just done a terrible job of covering this.
How do we look upon the evacuation plan? What has Joe Biden done well, and what has Joe Biden done wrong, in your opinion?
Well, the first thing you got to understand is that Joe Biden isn't responsible for any of this. Joe Biden doesn't do military strategy. He has military generals who've been doing this for 30 years that orchestrate all that. What he says is the Trump administration negotiated a ceasefire and a withdrawal plan with the Taliban. I'm not privy to what those terms were, and so I can't speak to whether that was beneficial for us or not. But all Biden said was, yeah, I want to continue to get this out of this war. This was a terrible war. I don't want us in this anymore. And then it's the general's job to figure out how to make all that happen in conjunction with the State Department. And what you're seeing now is the State Department's blaming DOD. DOD's blaming the State Department. It's a finger pointing game because all of them are a bunch of spineless, bureaucrats at that level. And so could it have been done better? I can imagine it probably could have been done better. But here's the point, and this is what I was trying to get across on my show, is that what people are really upset about are the optics. They're like, oh, this doesn't look good. This is another Saigon for America. But the end result would have been the same no matter what. The end result is that the Taliban is now going to take back over Afghanistan. 20 years we will have wasted in that country. And the only thing that will have changed is that the Taliban are now better armed and more organized than they ever have been. They're more dangerous now than they ever have been. And it is ultimately the Afghan people who will suffer for that. Ultimately, they will suffer for our decisions. And it's really unfortunate. And what I hope people realize is that, listen, you should not go to war idly. War is a game that most human beings don't have the stomach for. And it is something that hurts a lot of people. And when you combine that with military objectives that are unclear and with a government that has a lot of ulterior motives, then you've got a recipe for disaster.
Jason, you have information that most public does not have, probably 99% of that. What are we really missing in the Afghanistan story now? How come there was minimum resistance from the Afghan military, given the fact they are better equipped than the Taliban themselves? What are we missing? What is there to say? How come we've seen no resistance or very little resistance from the military that was equipped by the U.S., that was paid by the U.S.? Why weren't they fighting?
Yeah, there'll be a more long-winded answer, and I apologize for it, but I need to explain a few things to your audience so that they understand. Is that in Afghanistan, one of the things that you'll see constantly is the roads are very busy. There's no real traffic laws there. And so it's a lot of times bumper to bumper traffic everywhere you go. And anytime the cars start to slow down and stop, there'll be young children as young as 3-4 years old who will come into the street to sell you candy. And for a long time, that really bothered me. I would say to myself, well, why are these kids, why do they let these kids run through the streets? And it took me a little while, but I figured out the reason for that is because their families couldn't afford to feed all their children. And so if they didn't sell candy in the streets, they would be sold into child labor or sex slavery. That was their option. Because women can't work in Afghanistan, if your husband dies and you're a widower with young children, really the only opportunity you have to earn a living is to sit and beg in the street. And so what you would see is women, burqa-clad women sitting in the streets just begging for a handout from anyone who will help them support their family with little tiny babies, like infant children. That's the level of poverty that the Afghan people lived under when we arrived in 2001. And all of a sudden now we need to start, we need to start building infrastructure. We need to put an army together because eventually we want the Afghans to police themselves, and they need their own security force, their own police force. So let's start hiring people to do that and start training them up. Well, how do you decide who should be in the Afghan military, or who should be when we know the Mujahideen, we know that Al-Qaeda is out there. We know that all of these other like tribal militant organizations, the Taliban's out there. How do you keep the Taliban from infiltrating into the military and into the police force? Well, the short answer is that you can't. It's not like westernized countries where you have background checks and fingerprints and you can look at their criminal history. There's none of that. What happened was you found 4 or 5 guys that you were like, okay, we trust that these guys look okay. And then you say, hey, do you have any friends? And they'd go get their friends and they'd say, are you a good guy? And they'd say, yes, I'm a good guy. It's like, okay, well, you can come in. They're there for the money. They're there for the money so that they can feed their families. And what the military and what the US government decided to do was pay a lot of people to not do much, and to kind of sit around in the traffic circles with holding AK-47s and directing traffic. But really, their job was to do nothing. And the real issue in Afghanistan is that it's a very alpha male society. And so it's built on a very tribal sort of violence. And if I'm bigger and stronger, then I'm going to dominate you. And the clearest example I have of this is at the Afghan airport. One of the things that the US government decided to do was fund local Afghan police to stand guard at the airport. Now, these guys did nothing. They were really useless in terms of security, but it gave them a job. It was a show of force on the street. Great, okay? Well, one of the things you have to understand about Afghans is that if you give an Afghan man, and I mean this with no malice in my heart, this is just honesty. If you give an Afghan man an ounce of power, he will immediately begin exploiting people. So they would take this Afghan, they'd stick him out in front of the gate, and literally his only job is just to wave traffic through. That's it. Just wave it through. If you stick him on that gate at 9 o'clock in the morning, by 11:30, he'll be shaking down every single person who comes through that gate. Every single one of them. And that's the level of kind of authoritarianism that they're used to dealing with. And so now you have an army and a police force that's largely in it for the money, that really cares primarily about their own power and authority. And they're watching slowly as an encroaching Taliban army gets closer and closer to Kabul, and the noose begins to tighten around their nation. And then the Taliban come out and say, hey, listen, you know what? You got all this weapons and equipment that the Americans gave you. We're just going to kill you all. There's no reason for us to fight. The Americans are leaving. Just throw down your arms and you can join us and we'll build a country together again. And what do you think the Afghan generals did? They cut a deal. They cut a deal the same way we cut a deal so that we could leave Afghanistan without having to fight our way out. You notice that the Taliban didn't fire at us. They didn't attack us during our exfil. They left us alone. They wanted us to leave. And they didn't have to fight the military or the police either, because why would they stand and fight? Why not? I'll just give my equipment over to you and now I'll be part of the Taliban and be part of the new regime. It was never going to work. You could tell back in 2005 and 2006 that it wasn't going to work. And yet we decided we were going to live in this blissful ignorance in the hopes that something would change. It didn't.
Do you think that after United States and the allies and the NATO all left Afghanistan, do you think that there will be no more threat to the United States now that United States is actually gone from Afghanistan?
No. The notion that somehow there is no measure, there is no standard by which you could effectively articulate that America is safer today than it was in 2001. We've killed 800,000 people in the Middle East so far, I think in Iraq alone. We've displaced millions. I actually did a documentary on this about in Greece and the number of people who are being displaced from places like Afghanistan and Iraq. There is no way that we would be considered safer. And now what we just did was leave a better armed and better trained Taliban back in control of a country that we went into 20 years ago to, supposedly secure our own safety. So it's bad. It's not
That
good
is
at all.
very bad. Now, when we're talking about optics, right, it really looks bad. And it is
Yeah.
bad, just as the way it looks. It's really that bad. But what do we say, we the West? I always say we the West. What do we say to women and girls under Taliban, under the new regime, or the regime that was there before, that was obviously going to happen anyway? What do we tell them? What do we tell them and new generations that we spent 20 years there, we left, and there's nothing better going on for them in this new future that they are looking forward to, actually not looking forward to? How do you explain to somebody what we did and what we did not manage to do there?
This will sound harsh, but I mean, if I had no care or concern for the women and children and young girls who were there, and I have 3 daughters myself, so I am horrified at the atrocities that they are going to suffer under Taliban rule again. It just makes me sick to my stomach. But ultimately, what I would say is, we gave your military, your government, trillions of dollars and spent 20 years here to try and create a place where you could thrive. And the moment we left, your men failed you. Your own people are to blame for this now. At what point do we have to say you can stand on your own? Either that or Afghanistan becomes an American province. And we just say, we own this now. This is ours. We're now not going to be occupiers. We're just going to take this from you. And I don't think anybody would say that's right too. So there is no good answer for them. Wait a minute. What do you tell a girl who was going to school at 13 or 12 and now she's going to be sold off to some Taliban Taliban bigwig and start pumping out kids and wearing a burqa? What do you say to somebody like that? What do you say to a child now who will probably be sold into sex slavery because their parents can't afford to feed them? I don't answer to that. It's horrible. The world is an ugly, nasty, dirty place, and we're lucky to be where we are.
Yeah. What situation do you remember on the ground that was the most dangerous for you and your team during your time there in Afghanistan? Let's go back.
I can't answer that. I can't talk about that.
No?
No.
Okay.
No, I thread the needle here on security stuff, but there are some things that I can't talk about.
All right. But did you ever had a feeling that you wouldn't make it out, or you had a change of heart for being there?
Yeah, no, I've been shot at and blown up, It's like here's the thing. When you do the type of work that I used to do, you wake up every day, and in the military, they have something called the warrior's prayer, and I can't recite it for you, but everybody's got kind of their own version of it. It's just basically like, I accept the fact that today I may die, that today may be my day, and I go out into the world willingly with that understanding. And a lot of people don't understand what that's like to have to live like that every day. I didn't have as much of a struggle with it as some people did. But yeah, were there times when I thought I wasn't going to come home? Yeah, more than one time.
Would you do it again?
No. And the only reason I pause is that I have men that I owe, because in that sort of environment, you meet people that you build relationships with and that, who have helped you make sure that you get to go home to see your family. And I think if one of them said to me, I need your help with this, I need you to come, then I would have to say yes. But I would not want to go and do what I did before. My job now is very different, and I'm old now, so.
I love the Tesla files, by the way. We all do. We all do. Very proud of Nikola Tesla. We claim.
Oh man, yeah,
claim
it's
him,
just.
But he doesn't really belong
Such a
to
fascinating character.
All right. I had a couple of veterans on the show. A British veteran that served 4 tours in Afghanistan. MC, Trevor Colt, MC, and Emmett Hadjic, American veteran. And they all tend to blame each other for the outcome in the Afghanistan story. And they all tend to blame Joe Biden and the administration for how it ended. And I see you have a completely different opinion. You think Joe Biden did what he had to do for what is in the best interest of the United States, and that he of course had generals that made certain decisions on how it was supposed to go and how it actually went. How come that veterans on such high level don't have the information that you have, on which you base your opinions on, which are very, very different from anything that we've heard so far?
Well, I mean, some people they're very patriotic, and I was very patriotic when I joined the Marine Corps at 19. I was very much in favor of this idea that we should spread freedom and democracy, that people want that. In America, we would refer to me as a neoconservative. I just believed in fighting wars against bad people and being the world's 911 force. And when I got to Iraq in 2005 and saw and started to see inside of the way the machine works, the military industrial complex and the State Department, I changed my views. I said, this is what I thought I was doing here. That's not what I'm doing. But if you're a Lance Corporal, if you're a sergeant on the ground in Afghanistan and Kandahar, living out of a tent, just doing what you're told, going on patrol, you may not have the same insight as I do. And we've all lost people and know people who didn't come home. Some people take that hard, and they need somebody to blame for that. I might disagree with some of my brothers who would say we need to stay, or that we didn't do it right, or that some political statement like Joe Biden screwed it up. But ultimately, that's not the way government works. It just isn't. It's not Joe Biden's fault any more than it's Donald Trump's fault. It's a series of debables.
Or Bush's fault, right?
Or Bush, yeah. It was a series of bad decisions going back, 18, 17 years. Who do you blame for that? A lot of people have blame. All we did now was we ended a lot of costly life that would have been lost had we stayed. Or did we leave a big mess? Yeah, we did. And that should be a lesson to every single person the next time the US government starts talking about invading another country, is say, hey, when did this work for us? When did you actually have success? Point to one time in history, because you can't. We talk about this stuff. We have good intentions, and it always ends the same way. We leave a country worse than we found it. And I find that
history repeats itself. How come we see the history repeating itself? We see over and over U.S. doing the same thing and then doing it again and again. Do you think that if U.S. stayed in Afghanistan for another, let's say, 10 years, that things would be different than they are today? Because a lot of people argue that U.S. shouldn't leave Afghanistan. Why? I mean, 20 years ago and today, it's basically the same situation. So what if U.S. stayed for another 10 years, let's say?
That wouldn't have made any difference. I mean, a lot of people say a lot of things. A lot of people are wrong. It's a beautiful thing about living in America is you still have the right to be wrong. You can hold whatever opinion you want to. I'll sit and box with anybody on staying versus going and the successes that we've had. I don't know how anybody can look at what's happened over the last 20 years in the war on terror and see it as anything other than a colossal failure. This idea of occupation and installing our own dictators in the hopes of providing greater security for America doesn't work. And so, if it doesn't work after 20 years, what's going to happen after 30 years? What's fundamentally going to change? Nothing, because you've got the same people running the show. You're talking about, listen, our military are really good at winning wars. They're really good at fighting the enemy and destroying things. Like I used to be a Marine. We're really good at breaking stuff. Okay? But when you start interjecting the State Department and the U.S. government into some of this stuff, you got to understand you're dealing with some of the most incompetent people on earth. These are not the smartest. These are not the brightest bulbs that were plucked from these colleges and taken to work in government. These are the dimwits. These are the people who have trouble tying their shoelaces, who are just in it for the money, which is why you see all of these people now as we're exfilling from Afghanistan, who are all pointing the finger. Oh no, it's State Department's fault. Oh no, it's the general's fault. Oh no, it's the Afghan people's fault. It's the intelligence fault. You know, they're all just pointing fingers because they all suck at what they do. And it's important, again, before you go giving government a lot more power and a lot more authority to go invade another country, that you recognize that these people largely don't know what they're doing, and they're just playing a game of how long can I hold my job and how fast can I rise, how much power and authority can I muster before I got to get out. And that was, from what I saw in Afghanistan, that was what most people were doing.
What are we looking at today when it comes to Afghanistan, Afghan men, and the Taliban?
Yeah, I mean, so I think as I said before, one of the things about Afghanistan is it's very tribal, and it's also very alpha male. And one of the things that you notice is that they're most of them aren't that tough. We don't have a hard time killing Taliban in Afghanistan. That's not really the issue. The issue is that we're fighting a war with a timeline, and they don't have a timeline. We transfer our troops out every 12 months, 6 to 12 months. They live there. They live in the hills. They live in the mountains. They live among the people. They've got 20 years fighting for their homeland. And again, they're terrible in terms of their human rights, in terms of their willingness to allow women to go to school and all of that stuff. They're really terrible as a group. But we're the people who were there fighting the war. We're not necessarily the aggressors, but we're the ones who showed up on their soil. They have all the time in the world. And so their main goal is survive. How do we survive long enough that Americans finally get tired and they leave? That's what we did when the Russians showed up. And when the Americans showed up, we're doing the same thing. And now you see, they survived. The ones who lived now will occupy the seats of power in Afghanistan. And they're talking about how they want international credibility. I don't believe it. I've known them for too long. There's no way that they're going to do that. It's just going to be a big mess. So
that he will not, or the United States government will not recognize Taliban as the new government, legitimate government in Afghanistan.
Well, what are they? Sense, who cares?
Right? It makes sense.
Yeah, but who cares? Who cares? That's just lip service that the government says, oh, we won't recognize them. Okay. Like the second that we need something from them,
still gonna be there.
We'll send $1 billion over
their way. Yeah, who cares?
Yeah. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's the way it works. And the second that we need the Taliban again to help us with something, they'll be our friends again. And we'll send them money, and we'll send them weapons and ammunition. We'll do whatever we got to do. Because that's the nature of government. And that's not just American government, that's government in general.
And you said one thing, you said if we wanted to, we could have wiped out Taliban if we wanted to, because United States Army, military has the power to do that. Taliban don't. And this is why we are seeing that 20 years into what they call American war in Afghanistan ended up exchanging Taliban with the Taliban. So nothing really changed, right? So who are we fooling?
I would correct one thing that you said. I'm not saying that the Americans can defeat the Taliban. You clearly can't do that. What you can do is push them down, right? You can suppress their ability to have an impact on the country for periods of time. That's what we did in Iraq, is that we could suppress the fighters for a period of time. But the second that we let up, they would come right back again. And the reason for that is because they live there. That's their home. They don't go away. They just get quiet. They just blend back in. And then once you let up on the gas, they just come right back again. And so that's why I say you're fighting an unwinnable war. I don't know of a single nation who's ever won a war of occupation. And so we got to be aware of those things before we go making a decision to invade another country.
Just one more question to go back to the difference between Iraq and Afghanistan. You've been in Iraq, you've been in Afghanistan. What is the main difference between these two countries when it comes to U.S. involvement and U.S. foreign policies in these two countries, according to you? And your experience,
I think that, yeah, and mine will be limited. What I can tell you is it appeared to me, and this is purely anecdotal. It appeared to me that America thought Iraq had a better chance of having a sustainable, electable government for many reasons that I won't even try and guess at. But I know, you have the Kurds in the north and you have the Iraqis in the south. They already had some of that infrastructure there with Saddam. And so I think they spent and invested a lot more time in trying to build a cohesive government. Whereas Afghanistan was more tribal, and what they really did was they took Karzai, who was Karzai's tribe was the main opposition to the Taliban when the Taliban took power in the late 80s, right after the Civil War. It might have been 96, right? And so when we came into Afghanistan to fight Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, we found Karzai and said, okay, Karzai's our guy because he's the guy who's been fighting the Taliban during the Civil War. That's the major difference that I saw. That they didn't really try and create a cohesive elected government. They just tried to find a tribal leader that they could put in power that would, be sympathetic to the U.S. government.
And before we wrap up, there's such a wide range of things that you do. You're a personal branding expert, you're an entrepreneur, film producer, as we know, and host of Wealth, Power, and Influence. Tell us a little bit more about what you do now, Jason.
Yeah, the best way to describe what I do now is I help people in America, well, around the world too, anybody who wants to gain more freedom, more personal autonomy over their life, by teaching them how to start and grow digital businesses. And I believe that we are at the beginning of a really big transition that's going to change the way that our entire economy works with blockchain and a lot of these other things that are coming, smart contracts, automation, artificial intelligence. That there's going to be a lot of people who don't have the skills that are necessary to survive in this new economy. And I'm trying to help as many people as possible work through that transition. And that's kind of what the show is about, as we talk about culture and current events, and I try and share some of the ideas with them. And then my main skill now is behavioral science and learning how to apply behavioral economics and behavioral science to business. And so I'm really good at branding. I'm really good at marketing and helping people start businesses. And so when I left the contracting world, that's what I went to do. I started a company financial education company, and now I have a consulting company that works with people who are tired of waiting around for government for some elected official or party to take over and finally give them freedom. And we're just like, no, I just want to do it for myself. One of the things I've learned over the years is that your wealth and your freedom are very closely linked together. And so the more wealth you have and the more mobile your income, the freer you are. And Afghanistan's a great example of that. If you were wealthy and you had the ability to work from anywhere, you didn't stay in Afghanistan, you left. And when things get bad, the people who suffer the most are the poorest and those with the fewest choices.
That was well said. I would like to conclude with that and add that you are also a great investigative journalist. I love you on the Tesla Show. I just have to say it again.
Thank you.
Really great fan, big fan. Jason, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your opinions, and your knowledge and your insight and intel on the Afghanistan story. I think this will be, it's quite clear. It's quite clear now what we are facing. But Afghanistan, of course, is going to stay in headlines for quite some time, what it seems to be. And of course, hoping to catch up sometime soon again and hoping under some better circumstances.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. This was Jason Stapleton. Thank you for watching. Amica Ferrer, Gotic. Jason Stapleton.